Alright, so for this video, imagine now that you've decided that yes, as a firm you would like to expand internationally to grow your profits. What research has indicated is that the pressures that firms face in that global marketplace limit its ability to realize things like location economies and those experience effects, the ability to leverage products and skills across the firm. So all those advantages we spoke about on the last video are often limited in a sense, by certain types of international pressures. Now, the pressures that we're looking at here, unfortunately, have nothing to do with this guy. The sad bit is I feel a lot of people watching this video won't know who that is. If you don't, just Google Freddie Mercury and thank me later. No, the two types of pressures we're looking at here are the pressures for cost reductions, which force firms to lower the cost of producing each unit. And secondly, the pressures to be locally responsive, which require firms to adapt their products to meet specific requirements in each market that they sell them in. And typically this leads to increased costs. So you've got these two competing pressures which effectively clash against one another and force firms to choose certain strategies, and the amount of each of these two key pressures which a firm finds itself subjected to will be a key determining factor in which international strategy it eventually ends up choosing. So given that, let's go through each of these two pressures in turn. Alright, the first, as I say, is the pressure for the company to reduce its costs. So often international businesses find themselves faced with pressures for cost reductions because the global market, more than any national market, is hugely competitive. You're not just competing against a single country's firms, you're now competing against all these global competitors, which usually means that you have to become more cost efficient. You have to reduce your costs to make yourself give yourself a better chance of ensuring and maintaining those profits that we're after. So pressures for cost reduction can be particularly intense in those industries producing commodity-based products that fill universal needs. So obviously steel, whether it's being sold in Australia, the United States or India, fulfills relatively the same needs. Sugar does pretty much the same job irrespective of what country it's sold in. And it doesn't matter whether you get your petrol from a nice modern service station or the crappy old gas station. The petrol itself is going to do pretty much the same job. So these industries that have universally used products that fill these needs that are relatively the same across the globe are where we see the most intense competition here. These pressures for cost reductions also tend to be quite intense when a lot of the major competitors within that particular industry are based in low-cost locations. So obviously something like the textiles or clothing apparel manufacturing industries especially, or have especially high pressures for cost reduction here, because a lot of the major firms in that industry are based in low-cost developing nations. Also where there is persistent excess capacity, and also where consumers are in that position of power and face low switching costs. So it's cheap and easy for them to go from one brand to another. That obviously forces firms to be more and more cost competitive in terms of their pricing, and to achieve that profitability at the same time as offering a low price, you need to reduce your costs. So these are very common issues for firms that compete on a global scale, where they're finding this significant pressure to reduce their cost structure. At the same time, a lot of firms also face pressures for local responsiveness, and this is in response to differences in consumer tastes and preferences around the world. So what we find is that even within, for many industries, even within a single industry or market niche, people will expect different things from their products in that industry depending on what country they are in. So that might be due to different laws or legislations, consumer tastes, preferences, a wide variety of factors here. A good example to illustrate this point here is pickup trucks, or utes as we know them here in Australia. If you go to Europe, most of the utility vehicles there, they're quite small, like this little Fiat, then very much used by businesses, not many privately owned utility vehicles in Europe. If you wander over the Atlantic to the North American market though, for the same industry, you'll find they tend to be used a little bit differently. As illustrated here, it doesn't matter whether you need a pool party, whether you want a pool party, a slumber party, utility vehicles or pickup trucks, as they are known in the United States, are the way to go. So understanding, obviously this is a slight exaggeration, but the key point here is that there are key differences in the expectations and preferences from one market to another in a single industry, for many industries on a global scale. There also might be differences in infrastructure and traditional practices. So for example, if we look at electrical items, if you go to the North American market, they tend to be based on this using 110 volts, while in Europe they use typically the standard measurement is 240 volts. So obviously you need to understand, if you're an electrical consumer electrical supplier, to tailor your products to suit those local expectations and actual requirements in this case. There might be differences in distribution channels. So obviously, if we're looking at the food market, for example, Germany has a relatively small number of larger retailers who dominate that market. Whereas if you wander on down to Italy, there are many, many smaller firms, many family-owned businesses who sell food related products, often from sort of stalls, and less multinational based businesses. On the other hand, there might be host government demand, so as I say, legal requirements potentially. So the healthcare system differs substantially from one nation to another. And as you can see here, that will have significant implications for something like a pharmaceutical firm and its competitors, and how they have to tailor and adapt their products to suit these local requirements. So you've got overall these two competing pressures, one which is forcing you to reduce your costs and effectively standardize your product range across the globe, and others which are actually forcing you to raise your costs because you have to change your product to suit these local requirements, which cost money to develop those different products and different adaptations to be offered around the world. As I said before, the level to which your firm and the industry is subjected to each of these two key pressures for global competitiveness will impact which of four strategies your firm ends up choosing on an international scale. And in the next video, we're going to look at how these competitive pressures influence those four strategies, and obviously what the four strategies themselves actually are.